They said the ceremony would be better without me. The words still echo in my head, sharp as glass. It was just before dawn when the phone rang, dragging me from sleep. I recognized the number, the committee's office, and thought they might be calling with a last-minute detail, maybe even an apology for the months of silence. Instead, I was met with voices wrapped in politeness so tight it strangled the truth. "It would be best," they said carefully, "if you didn't attend the dedication." I asked why. The answer was a soft dagger. "Too many political sensitivities. We don't want to cause tension." Cause tension? I had funded half the building. I had stood in the mud with a shovel when there was nothing but a cracked foundation and a dream. I had written the checks when the city hesitated, when sponsors backed out, when everyone else claimed it was too risky. I was the reason there was even a hall to dedicate. But in that moment, none of it mattered. My name, my work, my years, stripped from the story before the curtain even rose. I hung up slowly, listening to the deadline, and in the silence after, the room felt heavier than it had in years. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the realization that people who had once smiled into my face had decided I was an inconvenience to be hidden. Outside, the first light of morning brushed against the window. It should have felt like hope, but all I saw was the cold, empty truth. They had shut the door on me, and they expected me to stay outside. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? And if this story touches something in your heart, please subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to life. Now, let's continue. The calendar on my desk still held the red circle I'd drawn months ago, bold and certain, like a promise that could not be broken. That date had been my finish line, the day I would finally see years of work, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance honored in the open. I had imagined it so many times, the rows of chairs, the speeches, the unveiling. I had pictured myself sitting in the front, not for vanity, but because I had earned that seat with every late night, every personal risk, every yes I'd said when others turned away. Now that circle felt like a cruel joke. I opened the official program they'd posted online, scrolling slowly, almost unwilling to reach the part I feared. My name was nowhere. Page after page listed donors, leaders, visionaries who had come in long after the foundation was laid. I had been erased cleanly, like I had never existed in the story at all. Even the seat that was once set aside for me was gone. No reservation, no acknowledgement, not even a line in the special thanks. It was as if someone had taken a knife to the narrative and cut out every piece where I had breathed life into the dream. The hall itself, every brick, every polished tile, stood on a history they were now pretending had nothing to do with me. And the worst part was, they seemed to believe they could get away with it. I sat there for a long time, staring at that red circle, feeling its color bleed into something darker. Not anger, not yet, but a heavy grief that pressed into my chest. It wasn't just the loss of recognition. It was the understanding that they had decided my chapter in this story had already ended, when in truth I hadn't even spoken my last word. They could strip my name from the programs, edit me out of the speeches, and pretend my presence had never mattered, but they could not rewrite the truth carved into the very bones of that building. Those walls did not rise from empty promises. They rose from my sleepless nights, my quiet calculations, my steady hand when the ground beneath us threatened to give way. I remembered the winter storms that halted construction for weeks, when the funding dried up, and the city considered abandoning the project altogether. I was the one who kept it alive, who signed the guarantees no one else dared to sign, who walked through the half-built frame with a flashlight in my hand, imagining the daylight would pour through finished windows. I had stood on that muddy ground before there was even a name for the hall. I had felt the wind bite at my face as I negotiated deals over the phone, convincing suppliers to extend credit just a little longer, promising them this dream was worth the wait. I had sat across from contractors late into the night, coffee growing cold between us, hammering out solutions when every plan seemed to crumble. And when the city's budget committee voted to cut the final stage of funding, I had written a personal check so large it nearly bled me dry. Not for glory, but to see the work through, to give the community a place it could be proud of. That hall wasn't just brick and stone. It was years of my life, my faith in something bigger than myself, my refusal to let it die when others walked away. They could hide me from the ceremony, but they couldn't erase the fact that without me, there would be no doors to open, no stage to stand on, no dedication to attend. The irony was almost bitter enough to taste. They would gather in a place built on my sacrifices, speak of vision and commitment, and pretend I had nothing to do with it. But truth is stubborn, and the walls remember. Betrayal has a sound. It's not loud. It's the faint echo of doors closing in rooms you once entered freely. I could still see their faces in my mind, the same faces that had once leaned close to mine, laughing over shared victories, clasping my hand in gratitude when I pulled the project back from the brink. Those same eyes had once carried warmth. Now they carried the cold calculation of people who had decided my absence was easier than my presence. They called it keeping the event clean. I'd heard the phrase in whispers long before they said it to me outright, like an invisible stamp pressed into the air, clean of me, as if my presence was something that would smear their carefully polished image. I wasn't a scandal. I wasn't a liability. My only crime was refusing to fade into the background after I'd given everything I had, and somehow that was too much for them to stomach. It was a strange ache, one I knew too well, the heaviness of being both indispensable and unwanted. They had needed me when there were gaps in the budget, when deadlines loomed like cliffs, when every headline about the project was laced with doubt. They needed my steadiness, my name on the contracts, my signature that told lenders and suppliers this was safe, this was real. And I had given it without hesitation, because I believed in what we were building together. But now, when the cameras were ready, when the speeches were written and the ribbon was about to be cut, they decided the picture would look better without me in it. My value had expired the moment the last bill was paid. What hurt most wasn't the public erasure. It was knowing they'd made the choice together, probably nodding around a long table, the same table where we'd once planned the future side by side. They had erased me with the same hands that once reached for mine in trust. And yet, beneath the sting, there was a quiet truth I couldn't ignore. They might own the stage for now, but the foundation beneath their feet still carried my name, whether they chose to speak it or not. I sat at my desk long after the call had ended, the morning light creeping slowly across the floor. My hands hovered over the keyboard, and before I knew it, the words began to pour out. I wrote about the winter when the roof beams were delayed, and I had driven through sleet to meet the supplier in person. I wrote about the night the funding was cut, and I stayed up until sunrise drafting the proposal that saved the project. I wrote about the personal loans I signed for when no one else was willing to risk their own names. Every sentence was a brick of truth, stacked high, impossible to ignore. I listed names, dates, moments they had conveniently erased from memory. I reminded them who had been there first, when the hall was nothing more than an abandoned lot and a stubborn dream. My fingers moved faster as anger seeped through every keystroke. Not the wild, shouting kind of anger, but the deep, steady burn of someone who has been wronged too many times to still be surprised. When I finished, I read it back. It was sharp, undeniable, and devastating. It was the kind of letter that would leave them staring at their screens, knowing every word was true. And yet, as I sat there, the heat in my chest began to cool into something heavier, the knowledge of what would follow. They wouldn't respond with shame or remorse. They would respond with silence, the most convenient weapon of those who fear the truth. They would nod among themselves, perhaps even smirk, and file me away as bitter, difficult, a man who didn't know how to let go. Sending that letter would give them exactly what they wanted, a way to dismiss me without ever addressing the reality I had laid bare. So I deleted it. One tap, and the screen went blank, as if it had never existed. It felt like swallowing something sharp, letting it cut on the way down, but I knew this wasn't my battle to fight with words on a page. I had fought with actions my whole life, with quiet persistence that spoke louder than speeches. If they had erased me in public, then I would make my return in public. Not with a letter that could be ignored, but with a presence they couldn't pretend away. And in that silence, a decision began to take shape, slow and deliberate. I wouldn't demand my place. I would take it back in the only way that mattered. That night, the house felt too large. Every tick of the clock seemed to press into the silence, each one asking the same question I couldn't push away. Was I going to let them write my ending for me? I sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, the rest of the room swallowed in shadow, as if the walls themselves were waiting for my answer. The weight of the day pressed against my shoulders. The phone call, the missing name in the program, the ghosts of every handshake that had once felt genuine. Part of me, the tired part, whispered that it would be easier to stay home, to close the blinds, to pretend I hadn't cared as much as I did. I could let them have their day, let them pose for their photographs and deliver their speeches polished with lies. If I stayed away, there would be no stares, no whispers, no risk of being turned away at the door. It would be the quieter choice, the safer one. But safety had never built anything worth remembering. I had faced storms that could collapse steel, debts that could crush a man's spirit, meetings where I was told no so many times it began to sound like background noise. And yet, I had stayed. I had fought. Not for applause, but for the principle that something worth building was worth standing beside when it was finished. If I stayed home, it wouldn't just be their story that went unchallenged. It would be my own. They would carry on as if I had already surrendered, as if my absence was proof they'd been right to erase me. And that thought, that my silence could be mistaken for consent, settled into my chest like a stone. I wasn't going to their ceremony to beg for recognition. I didn't want their stage or their microphone. I wanted something deeper, something they couldn't give or take away, to stand in the place I had helped raise from nothing and know I had claimed it with my own presence. Not in secret, not as a ghost in the back of their memories, but in flesh and blood, where the walls could see me and remember who had given them life. By the time the clock struck midnight, the decision was clear. I would go. Not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as the man who belonged there long before they learned how to spell the hall's name. I opened the wardrobe slowly, as if I were stepping into another time. There, toward the back, wrapped in a thin plastic cover yellowed with age, hung the suit I had worn the day we broke ground for the hall. I hadn't touched it in years, but the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, memories surged like a tide I couldn't stop. That morning had been cold, the kind that bit into your lungs, but my chest had been warm with anticipation. We had stood on uneven dirt, a brass shovel in my hand, cameras flashing, speeches brimming with promises we were still naive enough to believe. I slid the suit from its hanger, feeling the weight of it. As I unzipped the cover, a faint scent escaped. Not cologne, not detergent, but something earthier. Sawdust, concrete dust, a trace of the building site clinging to the fibers, as if the fabric had stored away a piece of that day for me. And beneath it all, there was another scent I couldn't quite name. Maybe the memory of hope itself. I put it on, half expecting the seams to strain, the buttons to resist after all these years. But it slipped over my shoulders, as if it had been waiting for me. It fit better than I had any right to expect. Not because time had been kind to my frame, but because it had been even kinder to the man wearing it. The body might have changed, but so had the soul. The weight I carried now wasn't in the fabric. It was in the years, the lessons, the quiet victories, and the dignity earned when no one was watching. Standing before the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I understood the man staring back in a way I hadn't all those years ago. Back then, I wore the suit with the pride of someone just beginning to prove himself. Now I wore it with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to prove a thing. I smoothed the lapels, fastening each button slowly, deliberately. This wasn't just clothing, it was armor. Not the kind that deflects blows, but the kind that reminds you who you are when the world tries to make you forget. And tomorrow, when I stepped into that hall, I wouldn't just be wearing a suit. I would be wearing every hour, every sacrifice, every truth they had tried to bury. And I knew without doubt that it still fit. The morning of the ceremony broke clear and sharp, the kind of light that seems to polish every edge of the world. I stepped out into the cool air, the weight of the suit grounding me, the rhythm of my shoes against the pavement steady and certain. The city felt different that day, not softer but more awake, as if it too understood that something long overdue was about to happen. Each step toward the hall carried a pulse of memory. I passed storefronts where I'd once made hurried calls to suppliers, benches where I had sat in the rain scribbling notes on the backs of receipts, coffee shops where I had met with contractors who doubted the project could survive another month. The streets themselves seemed to hold the echoes of those days, a reminder that this walk wasn't just to a ceremony. It was a return to the place I had built one decision at a time. In the distance, I caught my first glimpse of the hall's roofline, rising above the neighborhood like a crown. It was exactly as I had imagined it all those years ago, and yet seeing it now sent something fierce through me. Pride, yes, but also defiance. This was not their hall, not entirely. You can't lock a man out of something that carries his fingerprints in every beam and brick. The closer I drew, the more the light shifted, bouncing off the glass panels I had personally insisted on, the ones the budget committee had wanted to cut. They'll make the space feel open, I'd argued back then. And now here they were, throwing the morning sun across the entrance in a blaze so bright it seemed to demand honesty. People were already gathering, small clusters of chatter spilling onto the sidewalk. I could feel eyes on me as I approached, not openly hostile, but cautious, as though my presence was a ripple they hadn't planned for. I didn't slow. The distance between us closed with each step, my heartbeat keeping time with the quiet truth in my head. This building stands on my work, my sacrifices, my unshakable refusal to let it die. And no matter what they print in their programs, no matter how they arrange their speeches, I belong here as much as the steel in its frame. By the time I reached the steps, the sun had climbed high enough to spill over the facade, bathing everything in gold. I paused for just a moment, letting it touch my face, and thought, this light has nothing to do with them. It's been here all along, waiting for me to walk toward it. They saw me before I reached the steps. It was almost physical, the way the air shifted, the way conversations faltered mid-sentence. Heads turned, as if pulled by the same invisible thread, eyes scanning me with something between recognition and disbelief. Whispers began to spread like the first ripples on still water, soft enough that I couldn't catch the words, but sharp enough that I could feel their edges. I noticed the quick glances, some darting away the moment our eyes met, others holding just long enough to measure my resolve. A few faces broke into small, reflexive smiles, but they were gone as quickly as they appeared, swallowed by the awareness of who might be watching. No one stepped forward to greet me, yet no one dared to tell me to leave either. It was as though the crowd had become an unspoken jury, each person silently deciding what to make of the man they'd been told not to expect. I kept walking, my steps unhurried but unyielding. Each footfall seemed louder than the last, carrying me through a sea of people who parted just enough to let me pass. Their perfume, their cologne, the faint scent of morning coffee, all of it mixed with the sharper, less tangible smell of discomfort. I could almost hear the questions in their minds. What is he doing here? Who told him? Does he know? But beneath that curiosity was something else, something more complicated. I saw it in the way a few older faces softened when they recognized me fully. They remembered. They knew the foundation of this hall wasn't only in the concrete, but in the years when my name was the one keeping the project alive. And maybe, just maybe, they were glad I had come. The entrance loomed closer, the stone steps stretching upward like a quiet dare. I straightened my back, not in defiance, but in a calm acknowledgement of the moment. I wasn't here to push through locked doors or make a scene. I was here to simply exist where I belonged, to let the truth stand beside me in plain sight. And as I placed my foot on the first step, the whispers didn't fade. They deepened, because now they knew I wasn't stopping. I chose the last row deliberately, a place where I could see everything without becoming the center of it. The chair was cold metal beneath me, the kind that makes you sit straighter, as if bracing against more than just its surface. A neatly folded program lay on the seat, its edges crisp, the paper still smelling faintly of fresh ink. I picked it up, smoothing it open, already knowing what I would and wouldn't find inside. Page by page, the names rolled out like a parade. Donors, committee heads, visionaries, whose involvement had begun only after the hardest battles were won. They were described in glowing terms, every adjective carefully chosen to sparkle under the lights. My eyes scanned the lists, the paragraphs, the acknowledgments at the back. My name was nowhere. I let my fingertips trace the lines of text, not out of bitterness, but with a kind of stunned quiet. It wasn't just the absence of my name. It was the audacity of their attempt to shrink years of sacrifice into nothing, as if the entire history of this hall could be edited to fit their version of events. It was almost laughable. How small they thought they could make me by leaving me off a sheet of paper. The truth was, my legacy wasn't ink on a program. It was steel beams, ordered on my word alone when the budget teetered. It was late nights spent in empty offices, drafting plans by hand because there wasn't money for a designer. It was the check I signed that kept the lights on when the entire project teetered on collapse. Those moments didn't fit neatly between the pages they were passing around today, and maybe that's why they'd left them out. Around me, the audience murmured in polite tones, the rustle of paper programs blending with the faint hum of anticipation. I glanced up at the stage, at the podium where speeches would be delivered by people who had never stood ankle-deep in construction mud, who had never heard the hollow echo of an unfinished hall, and wondered if it would ever be completed. I folded the program neatly and set it on my lap. If they believed erasing me from print could erase me from the truth, they had underestimated more than just my memory. They had underestimated the very thing that had built this place, my resolve. And that resolve was sitting right there in the last row, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be something they could hide. The speeches blurred together, a polite parade of carefully rehearsed words meant to flatter the living and honor the absent. I listened without truly hearing, my gaze drifting toward the far side of the stage, where a tall object stood hidden beneath a velvet cover. The fabric swayed slightly with each breeze, catching the sunlight in its folds. I knew what it was, or at least I thought I did. Then the mayor stepped forward. His tone carried that practiced warmth politicians wear like a tailored coat, but there was something in the way his eyes flicked toward the crowd, and then, briefly, toward me, that made the air seem heavier. He spoke of the hall as a gift to the community, of visionaries who saw beyond the present, of sacrifice and commitment. And then, as if some unseen clock had struck, he turned toward the shrouded plaque. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the cover free. The velvet slid away like water, and the sunlight leapt onto the bronze beneath. For a single heartbeat, there was no sound at all, not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the rustle of paper. The crowd was frozen, staring at the letters newly revealed. And then it came, a soft gasp, sharp enough to cut through the silence. Another, quieter, followed. The name they had worked so hard to erase was staring back at them, each letter carved deep into the metal, each stroke catching the light like a defiant truth. My name, not in ink that could fade, not in a speech that could be altered, but in bronze, heavy, enduring, undeniable. It was more than a nameplate. It was a statement, a refusal of erasure. Somewhere in the planning, in the politics, in all their attempts to rewrite history, someone had left a thread untied, and here it was, pulling the entire false narrative apart in front of everyone. I didn't move. I let the weight of the moment settle over the crowd, let the sunlight do the talking. For all their careful omissions, for all their rehearsed ignorance, here was the one thing they couldn't take back. Bronze doesn't care about politics. It doesn't bend to whispers or exclusion lists. It endures, and now my name would endure with it, standing watch over every event, every speech, every gathering in this hall, long after all of us were gone. The mayor's hand lingered on the edge of the plaque, his fingers tightening for just a moment, as though he could steady himself by touching the truth engraved there. I watched the muscles in his jaw shift, before he drew in a breath and stepped back toward the microphone. His voice, when it came, was different, less polished, less rehearsed, almost reluctant. "This hall," he began, then paused, clearing his throat, as if the words themselves were heavier than expected. "This hall exists because of a man who gave when no one else could." The sentence landed in the air with a weight the crowd could feel. It didn't have the rhythm of a prepared line. It was too raw, too edged with something real. For the briefest moment, his eyes searched the rows, sweeping over familiar faces until they found mine at the back. The space between us seemed to shrink, the conversations around me dissolving into silence. One by one, heads began to turn, following his gaze. I felt their eyes on me, curious, startled, some even recognizing. It was the kind of collective attention that can make a person feel exposed, but I didn't shift in my seat. I didn't nod. I didn't raise a hand. I stayed exactly as I was because the truth didn't need my movement to be seen. There was a subtle change in the air, a murmur not of disapproval, but of realization. In that single glance, the narrative they'd been fed cracked open just enough for light to get in. They could read between the lines. They could see the disconnect between the absence of my name in their printed program and its permanence on the plaque that would outlast all of us. The mayor's gaze lingered a heartbeat too long before he looked away, his voice smoothing back into the safer patterns of his prepared remarks. But it didn't matter. The shift had already happened. The truth, however briefly, had stood in the open, and no amount of ceremony could put it back into the shadows. I sat still, letting the moment breathe. They had wanted me invisible. Now every head that turned, every whisper that passed was proof that I wasn't. And I didn't have to say a single word. I rose slowly, not with the abruptness of someone demanding attention, but with the steady certainty of a man who knows he no longer needs permission. The chair's legs scraped softly against the floor, yet in the hush that had settled over the hall, the sound seemed to carry. My palms brushed against the fabric of my suit as I straightened, and for a moment I could feel the weight of every year I had waited for this, not as a burden, but as proof that I had endured. I took my first step into the aisle, and the echo of my shoe on the polished floor rang out like a quiet bell. People shifted in their seats, their bodies instinctively leaning back to watch. I did not hurry. Each pace forward felt deliberate, each one claiming ground they had once tried to take from me. The aisle stretched ahead, longer than I remembered, and with every step, the years in the shadows replayed themselves in my mind. The closed-door meetings I was excluded from, the decisions made without my voice, the events where my absence was treated as natural. And yet, here I was, moving through the center of it all, unhurried, unstoppable. No one spoke. No one reached out to block my path. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was the sudden understanding that they were witnessing something they could neither rewrite nor prevent. Or perhaps it was the realization that in this moment, my presence was bigger than their plans. The light from the entrance caught the edges of the plaque as I drew closer, and my name seemed to glint in recognition, as if the bronze itself knew this was where I belonged. I felt the collective gaze of the room pressing in, a mixture of unease, curiosity, and something almost like reverence. I walked as though the space had been mine all along, because it had. And with each echoing step, I knew the distance I was closing wasn't just from the last row to the front. It was from the margins of their story back into the heart of it, where I had always been, no matter how hard they had tried to forget. The plaque stood at eye level, the bronze catching every shard of light as if it were made to shine in this exact moment. I reached out slowly, my hand steady, the cuff of my sleeve brushing against the polished frame. My palm met the cold metal, and the chill traveled through my skin, up my arm, settling deep in my chest. I let it linger there, the kind of cold that doesn't push you away, but instead reminds you that what you're touching is real, solid, permanent. My fingers moved over the grooves of each letter, feeling the depth of the carving. It wasn't about possession. This was not a claim staked in public defiance. It was something quieter, heavier, a personal acknowledgement that what I had fought for, sacrificed for, believed in through every sleepless night, now stood here in a form that could not be erased. These letters would outlive speeches, outlive the programs handed out today, outlive even the memory of those who had tried to remove me. As I traced my name, memories rose unbidden. The vibration of machinery in the early days when the lot was still dirt, the sting of wind on my face as I argued for higher quality materials, the weight of the final check I wrote, knowing it might empty more than just my accounts. And now, here was the sum of it all, locked into metal that would hold its place for decades, maybe centuries, long after my footsteps had faded from this hall. I didn't need applause. I didn't need anyone to acknowledge what they had tried so hard to bury. I was standing in front of proof, not the kind that asked for recognition, but the kind that simply existed, undeniable and immovable. The building would host countless events, see new faces, new leaders, new generations come and go. But my name would remain, not as decoration, but as a quiet truth. They would have to pass by every single time they walked through these doors. I let my hand rest there a moment longer, feeling not triumph, but something deeper. Peace. This was the kind of victory that didn't roar, it simply endured, and in that endurance it said everything that needed to be said. I stepped back from the plaque, letting my hand fall to my side. There were eyes on me still, some curious, some uneasy, some softened by the weight of what they had just witnessed. I didn't acknowledge them. I didn't need to. The truth was already hanging in the air, heavier than the speeches, stronger than the polite applause that would follow once the ceremony resumed. Without turning toward the stage, without offering a handshake or a smile, I began to walk back down the aisle. My steps were as steady as they had been on the way up, but now there was no question of why I was there. The whispers had gone quiet. Even the shuffle of feet seemed muted, as though the room understood instinctively that this wasn't a moment to interrupt. I passed the rows of chairs, the faces half lit by the spill of sunlight from the entrance, and each stride carried with it a release, the shedding of years spent in the shadows, the quiet satisfaction of having stepped into the light on my own terms. I didn't look back. I didn't need their applause to know I'd done what I came to do. When I reached the doors, I pushed them open, and the day met me like an old friend. The air outside was different, crisp, unfiltered, free of the stale weight of pretense that had filled the hall. I drew in a deep breath, and it settled in my chest like something I'd been missing for years. Justice, I realized, isn't always won through battle or noise. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just showing up when they expect you to stay away, standing where they hoped you'd never stand, and letting the walls, the very ones you helped raise, tell the story they tried to erase. As I walked away, the hall stood behind me, gleaming in the morning sun, my name catching the light with every shift of the breeze. It would remain there long after today was forgotten, long after those who had tried to exclude me had moved on. And every time the doors opened, every time someone looked at that plaque, the truth would speak, not in my voice, but in the permanence of what I had built. I didn't need to say a word. The walls were saying it for me.